In this lesson, we'll take a look at the Arnold Renderview. So I'm going to just open up the regular Renderview here by pressing this button. And you can see it's on my software, so let's just give it a quick render on the shot cam. So this is what it looks like, and I'll just keep that. And you can see that all of our models are showing up, and you can see that there's a default light and it's lighting up the scene. So that's not the case with Arnold, so let's just change this to Arnold. And then what we'll do is change the test resolution to 50% so that it's a little bit quicker to render. Make this a bit bigger, and I'll just give that a render. Okay, so now you can see that Arnold has rendered the scene and it's completely black, and that's because there's no lights in the scene. So it doesn't have a default light. So we just need to create one of those. So I'm just going to go to Arnold, Lights, and we'll create an area light, one of the most common lights for Arnold. Give you the most realistic results. And let's just minimize this for a second. And it's in the scene, so I'll just move this up and scale it. You can see this. And I'll just rotate this, and you can see there's a line. And let's just make sure that this faces downwards here. And I'll just move it up a little bit. And maybe just go to the perspective and come forward. Okay. Normally you can see where the lights are. So let's just position it roughly above the objects, and I'm going to go back to the shot cam. And then what we'll do is use the IPR view here. So I'm going to go to IPR, and we'll just increase the exposure here. So I'm just going to increase this, and as I increase this, you should start to see something. And the reason that it's so dark is because Arnold has exponential fall off by default. In other words, the lights fall off in a realistic way, so they don't just go on forever. They've automatically got quadratic fall off on them. So that's why the lights look realistic in Arnold already. So that's a good thing about the lights in Arnold. So I'm just going to increase this a bit more just so you can see this. And I'll talk more about these parameters a bit later in a later lesson. But you can see that Arnold by default will create bounce lighting. So the light is coming down, hitting the floor, and then coming back up. So if you look at this grape, you can see you're getting bounce lighting, and I haven't even done anything yet. This is just the default settings. So it's a really simple workflow, and it just does everything properly. It does ray tracing, so it's going to give you some really nice results. So I'm just going to stop this IPR. So this is the render view, and I'm just going to close up the render view. And let's open up the Arnold render view. So I'm just going to click on this button here. And again, we're going to have to set our test resolution here because it's completely separate. So I'm just going to say 50%. And then we'll just go to Window, and we'll say Real Size. Okay. And we'll just make this a bit smaller here. Okay, so now we can see our view. You might notice that it looks a little bit different to the standard Maya one. And that's because the color management is on by default, but it's not showing in the viewport. So if you go to this little icon here and just type in gamma 2.2, you should get the same result as you had before. Okay, it's a little bit annoying that it's not on by default, but there you go. So let's just carry on along the top here. So we've got our AOVs here. So if we had things like specular and reflection and things like that, we'll have a look at AOVs later, but if we have those AOV passes, we can actually see how they look in this view here, which is really useful for diagnosing, and we'll use that in later lessons. Then we can pick the camera, which is great. Then we've got the color. You can pick individual channels, red, green, and blue, or the alpha, and then it toggles back to the full color. Okay. Then we've got the region. So if I click on that, I can actually pick a region and drag it around, and you can see it's going to update that. By default, it's an IPR view. So in other words, it's changing. You can see it's updating automatically. So therefore, if I change the intensity down here, you can see that it's actually updating, which is great. If you don't want that to happen, you can go over to this little button here and press stop. And then it's going to stop the IPR. And you can just make the changes that you want. And then you can press play. This is very common in big scenes where you don't want it to start to calculate stuff before you've made your changes. So you might change a few different lights and shaders and bits and bobs, and then you can press play and then see what it looks like. Okay. Also, this render region is useful for bigger scenes as well. So you can, let's say we're doing the shading on the grapes, we can just focus on the grapes, and then the update will be a lot quicker on just the grapes. So you can grab the corners here to make this bigger and smaller. I'm just going to turn that crop off. We've also got exposure here, and this is just for the viewport, so you can see that it's going to increase the exposure, and that's the same thing as sliding this slider here. Okay, and you can press this to reset that to 0. This button here is to translate the scene. So if you want to keep your scene the way it is, it's translated into Arnold, and if you want to keep it the way it is, you can press this button to turn it off. So if I move my camera in this scene, then it's not going to update. If I turn it on, it will update. Okay, so you can move your camera around and you can see it's going to update, which is really cool. Okay, I can undo my view changes here, so let's go to view and we'll just click on this undo view change. Okay, so we're back to the way we were. The other cool thing you can do is you can click on the objects and select them, which is really handy. Why is it handy? Well, normally you're going to be rendering and then you'll turn on the IPR and then you want to adjust something on the shader, so you'll click on that and then you can just go to the shader. Just move this over a little bit so you can see, and then you can adjust the shader and see it update. So that's pretty cool. So you can then click and just click on these objects and you can see that they update. Now if I were to turn on 3D manipulation over here, this little tick box, I can actually move the camera in here. So if I just use my regular viewing controls, I can actually just move my camera right inside the Arnold Renderview, which is really cool. So they've tried to minimize your use of the viewport, so you can actually just go in and select things, adjust the shaders, and do what you need to do. And if you need to adjust your lights, you can go into the light lister and then adjust those. So you can go to the light manager here and you can adjust the intensity, for example. And typically you'll have a bunch of area lights here and a few different types of lights, and you can adjust those and balance them. So I can close that up. And I'll just undo the view again. You can use the square brackets to undo. It's a shortcut for this undo view. Okay, so moving along here, the other thing you can do is you can put in a background here as the background. So you can change the color, for example, and then change this to an image. So you can say background image. So I'm going to load in an image from my source images folder. So if you set your project, you should get this already. I'm just going to grab it from another. So we go to source images, background, and then I'm going to say Sapper blurred, open, and now you can see that it shows up there, and you can either apply the color management or not. So if I turn that off, you can see that it's not going to get gamma corrected. Turn it on, it is going to get gamma corrected. And then you can use the scale to adjust the position of this. We can also do that for foreground. So this is great for special effects. So you can use this to load in your background, and you can use the plate and put it in there. Then you can turn this on, and maybe if you've got some foreground, let's say you've got a keyed character or something, you can grab a still and just throw it in there to see what it's looking like. So that's pretty handy. That's just a quick tool so you can quickly see how it's looking in the scene. It's not supposed to be for the finished result, but it's quite nice. So I'm just going to turn that off, change the spec to color. So you can also make a snapshot, which is really important when you're doing renders. So if I click on this button here, I can actually take a snapshot of this render, and that's what we're going to do quite a lot of. So we can go back through our renders and see them and compare them. So that's really handy. Then you can also right click on that and you can say set as A, and then you can set another one as B and compare between them. We'll do this a bit later, and you can delete them and rename them. So if you wanted to save these images, you can save them here. You can save the original, or you can save the color corrected version. So if you don't do the color corrected version, this gamma won't be applied. So I would recommend, if you just want it to look like it looks here, you just save the color corrected version. You can also save the multi-layer EXR, which means that it will save these AOVs, and we'll take a look at this a bit later. So if you've got things like specular and reflection and all that sort of stuff in here, then it's going to save that out in the EXR. These will just save as JPEGs. So you can load your own images in and compare them as well. and you can save, if you turn this tick box on, it's going to save these snapshots as you go. If I go to window, you've got some framing controls here. You can frame all, or you can actually have the real size, which is the actual pixels. That's probably what I'd recommend. You can turn this on as a toolbar, so you can turn on show 3D manipulation as a toolbar, and you can show debug as a toolbar. So I'm just going to turn that on actually, because these are quite handy features. So this one here allows you to move the viewport as I showed you, and then this one here is the debug one. So it's inside render debug shading. What it will do is assign these utility shaders and give you some diagnostic information. So if you were to select one of these and say basic, let's go off this view here. I'll just need to press this button here just to see the actual view. So we're on the basic shader. So this is the basic shader, and you can see it's just a shader without any lights on it. It's just got the normals facing us. And if we go, which is great to see this is great to see the geometry, and it's really fast. So if you want to actually see what's in your scene, the framing of your scene, this shader is the best one to use. Then you've got occlusion. So this will just give you a nice occlusion render of your scene. Wireframe, got the normals. And this is great to see. It's good for diagnostics to see, oh, is that thing inside out, or is it, sometimes you get some weird results when you're rendering, and you can see if it's seeing it as inside out, or if it's got a little kink in it, or whatever. So it's pretty handy. Then you've got object, which shows you the different object IDs. So we've got a few more here. Then you can isolate selected, so I can click on this. Different objects, and isolate them. Go back to the regular. Okay, in view you've got enable AOVs, and this is for speed. If you wanted to turn this off and you didn't want to have those AOVs, sometimes it can slow things down a little bit, so you can turn these off if you're just rendering your scene and you don't want those to render. You can turn those off. And you can show different channels here. You can change your test resolution as we did before. You can work with your snapshots here. You can also darken out of region. So if I turn this on, if I change my region, it's going to make the rest of it dark around there. Okay, so you can see where the region is. Sometimes you work in really high resolutions and it's difficult to see where your region render is because you might have it as a little tiny thing like this. So it's quite handy as well. You can turn that back on if you want to. And then you've got some of the update options here, which is some of the similar options up here. Okay, so in this lesson we had a look at the Arnold Renderview, and we had a look at some of the cool features that are unique to the Arnold Renderview.